Welcome to the last episode in a legendarium series about the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War started in 1337 and ended 117 years later in 1453. It began during the Age of Chivalry and ended in the Age of Gunpowder. It started as a dynastic war and then became a total war between nations. Cannons reduced castles to rubble. Acts of great courage happened alongside unspeakable atrocities. Though she died at the age of 19, Joan of Arc is remembered 600 years later for good reason. After the many military catastrophes from 1415 onwards, France looked as if it might be conquered, despite having 8 Frenchmen for every 1 Englishman. That was helped in part by a civil war between the French, locked between the Armagnac and Burgundian branches of the royal house. However, in a career spanning less than 2 years, Joan of Arc dealt the English some stinging blows and revived the fighting spirit of the French army, even before the teenage King Henry VI was old enough to rule. In part because of this return of French morale, King Charles VII convinced the Burgundians to stop fighting him and instead fight the English at his side. Today we'll be talking about King Henry VI of England and King Charles VII of France, Margaret of Anjou, the new Queen of England, the French reconquest of Normandy, the rise and fall of the Duke of Suffolk, the Battle of Castillon, and the legacy of the 100 Years' War. When Charles VII took Paris in 1437, the 14-year-old King Henry VI of England faced a terrible crisis. Then again, his ancestors had to face such disasters while still teenagers. Of course, Henry VI was no Henry V, not even an Edward III. While he was sober, kind-hearted, and deeply religious, he was also weak, prone to agree with anything said by anyone, and not very intelligent. He also took too much time on pet projects, like founding King's College in Cambridge, while neglecting the defense of the empire his father had won. And on top of that, he wasn't too interested in war in general, while his French counterpart King Charles VII took it very seriously indeed. It is easy to despise King Charles VII for his refusal to help Joan of Arc, but he did find something he was good at: organization. While no warrior king like Henry V, he won the right to impose taxes by royal edict without having to argue with the Estates General. His court banker, Jacques Coeur, did much to expand French trade in the Mediterranean, so there was more to tax. Better still, to end his dependence on the knights who failed so badly at Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and Verneuil, he created a new professional army made up of the mercenaries who once prowled France. And better still, King Charles VII found something that worked much better than chivalry: gunpowder. In the late 1430s, King Charles VII created a professional artillery train under the command of the Bureau brothers, Jean, the king's master gunner, and his brother Gaspard. They were rich merchants who got into cannon making to make money, but the king tapped them to make war. Thereafter, French weapons grew in number and accuracy, and they proved their worth in many sieges. Gunpowder weapons allowed the French to eject the English from Normandy and Gascony with astonishing speed. Soon even the sight of cannons was enough to make English commanders sue for peace. Meanwhile, England suffered 2 crop failures in 1437 and 1440 that left the people hungry and Parliament in no mood to cough up new taxes. We've talked before about the many weaknesses of King Henry VI. Even worse, he preferred to let others make decisions for him, and such kings have a way of finding the worst possible people to make their choices. Henry found that man in William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk. His family had come up through the wool trade and been made nobles by King Edward III for loaning the crown money to finance the 100 Years' War. For most of his adult life, William de la Pole served in France under King Henry V. But when he came back to London, he saw firsthand that King Henry V had been the Lion of England, but his son Henry VI was a lamb being led to the slaughter. By then it was clear the war wasn't going well, so Suffolk proposed a royal marriage to end the fighting and shore up the English position in France. Suffolk found Margaret of Anjou, the 15-year-old daughter of Duke René of Anjou, as a new queen. While Duke René had some lovely titles like King of Jerusalem and King of Sicily, he was really a penniless noble who had a habit of losing wars. Nonetheless, Queen Margaret was niece to King Charles VII of France, and that made the marriage worth investing in. When she arrived in England, she was hailed as the princess of the longed-for peace. Hundreds of people climbed on the rooftops to see her. Lavish plays in the streets reenacted scenes from the Bible that depicted the bringing of peace. 3 days of feasting and jousting followed the wedding. But to get the royal engagement, Suffolk surrendered the hard-won counties of Anjou and Maine in France. That incensed the nobles, most of whom had done the fighting to win those counties. None more so than the Duke of Gloucester, who voiced his rage to anybody who would listen and probably a few who wouldn't. Suffolk, angered by the criticism, convinced King Henry to arrest his own uncle in 1447, and Gloucester died in custody less than a year later. Even though Gloucester probably died of a stroke, rumors said that Suffolk had Gloucester murdered. And despite this cruel rumor, King Henry VI promoted Suffolk to the exalted rank of Duke. But Suffolk's downfall was assured after English soldiers and Spanish mercenaries captured and sacked the French town of Faubourg, looting the houses of the rich and sacking the city. Now, the official line was that this was the act of a renegade mercenary captain, but in reality it was backed by the Duke of Suffolk himself to curry favor with the enemies of King Charles VII in France. Instead, King Charles VII used it as an excuse to restart the war and drive the English out once and for all. During this final round of fighting in 1449, the French had even better cannons. At the Battle of Formigny, the French opened with a cavalry assault on the English infantry and longbowmen, which ended with the French being slaughtered, just like Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt and Verneuil. However, the Bureau brothers arrived with breech-loading culverins on wheeled carriages. They fired faster as you loaded shells in the rear instead of the front. And rather than having the knights charge the longbowmen in heavy plate armor, the breech-loaders simply outdistanced the longbowmen and blew huge holes in their lines. Soon the French recaptured almost all of Normandy. And in October 1449, the Norman capital of Rouen fell to the French. The commander, one of Suffolk's favorites, saved his skin by bribing the French with 50,000 French marks. Desperate to hold on to Normandy, the royal council pawned the crown jewels themselves to raise money for emergency troops, who were then blown away by Bureau cannons. The French reconquest of Normandy was also a human disaster, not just a military disaster. Rivers of refugees were forced from the towns, with women carrying all their belongings strapped to their bodies with pieces of linen. Soldiers and landowners who made their careers in defending English Normandy tried to flee to the Channel ports, where they were hounded and murdered by the vengeful French. The Cheapside of London filled with refugees, former knights and lords and governors, who pushed all their worldly possessions in wheelbarrows, only finding work as thieves, day laborers, and prostitutes. And when Parliament met in November 1449, King Henry and his favorites came under fierce attack. First, the treasurer, Adam Mullin, had to go. And 2 months later, the House of Commons was presenting articles of accusation against Suffolk himself, not only charging him with the usual allegations of corruption and incompetence, but they even threw in the more sensational charge of Suffolk trying to seize the throne by marrying one of his children into the royal family. Suffolk denied the claims, of course, but Parliament wanted his head. King Henry VI tried to save the life of his favorite by banishing him for 5 years instead. But as Suffolk headed for the port, he was attacked by angry mobs and had to hide in a manor house. After writing a final letter to his 8-year-old son advising him to lead a good and Christian life, unlike his father, Suffolk boarded a ship bound for Italy. He was intercepted in the Channel by the ship Nicholas of the Tower and beheaded on the sloop adjacent to the boat. The sailors mounted his head on a stake looking out over the English Channel. And that was very nearly the end of the war. With Suffolk dead, Duke Richard of York and the Earl of Somerset began fighting for control of the government. And this struggle would later turn into the War of the Roses. However, they had one last chance to rebuild their power in France. The people of Bordeaux, a region in southern France, faced a tax hike and disruption of the English trade with the restoration of French rule. So they asked the Duke of York and Somerset, to save them from French rule, and of course the dukes were all too happy to agree. About 6,000 English soldiers under the Earl of Shrewsbury arrived in 1452, and they were welcomed by crowds cheering in the streets of Bordeaux, no doubt cheering the thought of lower taxes and restoring the English trade. However, the cheering faded around spring when King Charles VII showed up with about 10,000 of his friends, armed to the teeth, among them the Bureau brothers, who brought along their new cannons. When he saw a large cloud of dust one day, Shrewsbury assumed the French were retreating and decided to catch them on the hop. In truth, that dust was made by the French camp followers, who were leaving before the battle started. And instead, Shrewsbury found the French behind their fortifications with longbows and cannon at the ready, and the French paid the English the ultimate compliment by mimicking their tactics at Crécy and Agincourt. While the English charged their fortification, the French mowed them down with longbows and cannons. The Earl of Shrewsbury's horse had a leg blown off by a cannonball, and when it fell, Shrewsbury was pinned under it. Shrewsbury would become one of 4,000 English troops killed that day, to only 100 French killed. And they were as dead as the English king's claim to the French throne. And while France would know peace and prosperity in the next generation, the lords of England, enraged by King Henry's utter failure to defend France, rose up against him in the Wars of the Roses, which we will cover sometime in the next 1 or 2 weeks. So what was the legacy of the 100 Years' War besides the French driving out English rule? Well, quite a bit. The war made the French realize the importance of warfare to protecting their homeland from invaders, and that made them focus intensely upon military development. The French grew past chivalry and would dominate the European battlefield for centuries. England, having lost almost all its territories in Europe except the city of Calais, was left with a sense of being an island nation. That prompted it to look overseas for new growth, and they found it in North America, Africa, and India. The 100 Years' War also helped to shape English and French patriotism. England got the legendary victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, immortalized in the works of William Shakespeare. France found a patron saint in Joan of Arc, the subject of 20,000 books in the French National Library. On both sides of the Channel, the knight was knocked out of his saddle by the longbow, then blown to pieces by gunpowder. Chivalry and knighthood became cultural obsessions in the tourney field and the feasting hall, but on the battlefield, combat was taken over by professionals armed with muskets and cannons. Castles faded from Europe and were replaced with much more pleasant and pretty manor houses in the Baroque style, reaching its peak in the Versailles Palace of King Louis XIV of France. And that wraps things up for the Legendarium series on the 100 Years' War. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. If you've got anything to say, please leave it in the comments section. And if you want to see the other episodes, just go to Channel Legendarium and have a look. Thanks for joining me on this travel through history, and I hope you have a great day.